Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View Live. We have a great night ahead planned for you. Before we get started and we introduce our wonderful guest, just some reminders. Judy Boxner and I, Faith Borkowski, we are both going to be presenting at Research Ed in New York City on March 29th. Hopefully, we'll see some of our friends there. We're so excited to be presenting. If you have not gotten a ticket yet, please do so. There's still plenty of time. Then we go to Oxford in April, and we're going to be presenting at the World Literacy Summit. And that will be April 7th to 9th. And we cannot wait. We can't wait to meet our friends from all over the world. So those are two upcoming conferences. Also, we are delighted to announce that Judy and I now are presenting some services that are available to schools. So you can find those services on our website, theliteracyview.com. So don't forget theliteracyview.com, and you can see the services we are going to get into schools.
Yeah. And a lot of our services are already selling out. So book your services for summer. We're available to do retreats, events, parent workshops, data sessions, preparing for school sessions. We have a whole bunch of no BS services. They're going to be really interactive, fun, making professional development look as fun as our podcast. We are really, really excited. And we're getting phone calls nonstop. So book your sessions with Faith and Judy.
And then we also have a chance to advertise. And so if you would like to advertise with us, that's not an endorsement, but we are pleased to announce that we would be delighted if you would like to advertise with us, whether it's a service or a product. Just get in touch with us. You can contact us. Go to theliteracyview.com. So, all right, we gave people enough of a chance to come on, and we have our special guest, Sue Hegland, with us tonight. And Sue is the author of this fantastic book. I've had this book for a few years now, and it is Beneath the Surface of Words: What English Spelling Reveals and Why It Matters. She is joining us for our Takeaway Tuesdays on morphology and spelling. If you have not listened or watched our episodes, I'll quickly tell you right now what they are. They are episodes 109, which was Meta on Morphology with Danielle Colenbrander, and it was What Should We Do with All This Research? Then we had episode 111, and it was phonics versus SWI. And that was structured word inquiry with Pete Bowers. And that was, do we do this for beginning readers? And finally, episode 118, we had Richard Gentry on why spelling is important. So we are going to really tackle these subjects. And Sue is an expert in this area of spelling, morphology. Everybody was saying you have to get Sue on the show because we love her book and she has these practical ideas and it's so well written, and I could attest to that. You could find information about Sue on her website, learningaboutspelling.com, and her bio will be on our show notes.
Can I also remind the viewers of one thing? Just so you know, this session is a very special session. This is a live interactive session. So the chat will be open. So think about what we're saying. Think about what Sue's saying, Faith's saying, Judy's saying, past episodes. The chat is open. We will be monitoring the chat. So questions, comments, concerns, if you want to call cheers, if you want to call BS, this is a live interactive session.
All right. So Sue, There was research that came out that said that when we actually teach children about morphology, that there was evidence that trained words, meaning that the kids had words that the teacher planned, right? Teaching specific words had a larger effect size than untrained words. What do you think about having specific words to focus on for doing some analysis, word analysis? Do you think there should be a list, a suggested list, so that teachers have words that they would train students on? Or do you think as words come up in an incidental way, that this is when we should teach them the structure of words? Just curious what your thoughts are.
Great. So first of all, thank you, Faith and Judy, for having me here. It's really delightful to be here with you. Anytime anyone asks me to come talk about spelling, I'm all in. So this is fun for me. So, I'm not a researcher, and what I really focus on is how the spelling system works. And so my recommendation is that it's not that you need to teach these words and not those words, or that you should start with a certain set of words, and if you don't use those words, you're not going to be able to be effective. What we want to do is show kids how the system works. And you can do that with whatever is part of your phonics curriculum, your phonics scope and sequence. You can do it with words that come up in vocabulary. What's really important is for the teacher to have an understanding of how morphology works and how important it is, so they can bring that into their instruction when it is appropriate and when they see that kids need that kind of information. Is that helpful?
Yes. So I think that from all three of our guests we had on, there was a different approach. So I think Pete Bowers does not necessarily have a curriculum. It's more about using a more organic approach, I suppose, to this, although he talks about the importance of getting started early with morphology. But then our guest, Richard Gentry, when he was talking about spelling, he was all about having workbooks and having a certain set of words that then become what he called brain words. And so those brain words would be words that children know the orthography so well, they understand it, that they could then look at a word and know it instantly without having to struggle to decode it. It should be that automatic response. And he believed that there should be some special words. So, there's research on this. And then we have researchers who have some different ideas. I think we'd like to hear your feelings and your approach to this. Should it be more organic? I know you mentioned the teacher's knowledge is very important, but what do you think about having maybe a set curriculum of words for morphology? Or do you think as words come up in their reading that that's something that's important? What do you think about that?
So it's really, I understand the challenges that teachers have when they're in the classroom, and to say just as words come up, you just turn and start doing something with that. That's challenging. And most schools, most classrooms have some sort of a scope and sequence, a curriculum that they are following. And that there are good reasons for that, right? If you have a school district that has 5 different first grade classrooms and everybody's doing something different, when those kids get to second grade, there can be some problems. So, and I've talked to Pete Bowers about this. He's not opposed to anyone using a scope and sequence. He said, use the scope and sequence you have. What he's trying to do, from my understanding, and again, Pete is the one who can talk about this the best. He's trying to say, here are some ways that you can bring morphology into your teaching. And because most of what's in phonics sequences right now does not do very much with morphology. It might, bring in inflectional suffixes, S and ES and ED and that kind of thing. But it's almost treated as, I mean, this is me speaking now, but I feel like it's almost treated as less important than the phoneme grapheme relationships. And they are both equally important. And that's one of the messages that I try to get out to teachers is, of course, phoneme grapheme relationships are totally important, and morphology is equally important. So when you talk about a specific set of words, if you have a set of words to work with, great, use those words. If you don't have a set of words to work with, then you want to look at how you can begin to bring that in. I mean, if you're working with literally a student who's learning how to just do CVC words, hug and hat and bug, all you can work with oral language and say, look, when we bring this word hug and we add an S, we say more than one hug. What do we say? Hugs, right? When we say hat and we have more than one hat, what do we say? Hats. Do you notice that we say bugs and we say hats? But look, we spell them both with an S, because that's the unit, the morpheme, the element that's going to show us, oh, we're talking about more than one hug, more than one hat. And so you can just kind of prime them for that, because they're going to see that feature of the language everywhere. And so if a teacher wants to use a specific set of words, that's great. But the drum I keep beating is, it's all about teacher knowledge. It's about teachers having that background so they can say, I can see why. The other thing I will say is that one of the places, I get a cheer, yay. One of the places that I encourage teachers to start as well is the words that we think of as irregular, but that are not irregular once we bring morphology into the picture. So for the one I always talk to people about is says. So there is no reason anyone needs to teach says as an irregular word. It is 100% regular for spelling, right? Because we have S-A-Y, I say, you say, I play, she plays. We've got these, the base S-A-Y is pronounced the same as play and may and day and all these other words. But what's interesting is you add the suffix S and all of a sudden the pronunciation changes, and we can notice that. But we don't need to teach kids to spell says from s, z, because it's not going to work. We teach say, s-a, s-a-y, and then you add the S. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, it's no longer an irregular word. And there are a number of those words in the language that can be the entry point for talking about morphology. And in my book, I've got a little chapter 5, where it says and does and been, B-E-E-N. Those are all perfect to start with. They don't require any suffixing conventions. Kids can take those and that base, it can add suffixes. They can see how this works. Whether they are able to remember the spellings or not is not as important. It's the concept about how these structures are the framework for all of our words.
So Judy, you have been working with foundations for a while. And I know from foundations, they have trick words, but certainly a lot of the words that are considered trick words could be explained through morphology. Yet from my understanding, that was really not the way Wilson Foundations really explains it. It's really more of they're taught as a trick, and they should just remember how to spell it by letters, but they don't really get into the idea of say and said that, and that would help, wouldn't it? If you think about remembering the idea, say, says, saying, said, and how it changes, perhaps that would make a difference. What are your thoughts, Judy?
Wow, I'm kind of shocked, Faith. You mentioned the name of a program. We don't usually do that on the Literacy V that often, but it's okay. I'm okay. I'm recovering. I'm taking a deep breath, because you know how invested in the work that I'm doing at my school I am. All right. So I think that it comes back to what Sue said, content knowledge and pedagogy. So most of the people that I work with in foundations have shifted from calling trick words. And everybody that I know, including the foundations trainer that my school is actually working with, who I want to give a shout out, Dave Marsh, we all definitely point out what's regular, what's irregular. A lot of us have been putting hearts on the parts that the kids need to know by heart that are tricky for kids that are not phonetic. Another scaffold that my teachers and I developed, and I talked about it at professional development today in my school, it's a scaffold that I'm sure a lot of people out there are using, but I think is a pretty cool one, is also putting the irregular part in a different color so that the brain, it takes a little bit of the cognitive load off of the brain. So instead of having to, work on knowing every single letter, you capitalize on what's phonetic. There's so many parts of a word that are regular and not tricky. So I think it comes back to teacher knowledge. And I'm sure that a tremendous amount of people that are working with even a program like Foundations are shifting and using that language. And I think that even in Foundations, a lot of people might have not been paying attention, but it does say to be explicit and talk about what's regular and irregular. But I think that now that we're all paying attention to what's, best practice, many of us, I would say all of us, I'm hoping, that are watching the Literacy View are capitalizing on what's known, what's not known, what's regular, what's not irregular, and so forth.
But I want to just point out, I think the morphology part is really about thinking about seeing a meaningful part in the word,
right,
and being able to capitalize on that, like in the word does, recognizing that the word is do and adding the suffix es, and then the sound, the pronunciation changes.
That also comes into teacher knowledge, which is why you could have a million programs, right? Programs come and go. This year, school's using that. Next year, they dump it. They start something new. And the way we empower our teachers is that's how we move from just fidelity to integrity. And we have to, armor our teachers with that knowledge to be able to make those strategic moves and to understand how to explain it to kids in a way that aligns with the science and research. I mean, I partially do think that as new research and evidence comes up, programs might need to make updates, and they might need to make statements, and they might need to make revisions. But what happens? Then everybody has to buy 2.0 or 2.1 and spend more money? Like, what's the answer?
So, Sue, that's a good question. What is the answer when teachers have to follow a phonics program, and yet morphology doesn't come in until later? And yet we know that very young children are reading words with a plural S, just as an example, or ing. So, what is the answer when the phonics program is structured in a way that morphology is almost taught as something that's meant for later on? How do you work with that?
Faith, that's a great question. And so actually, can I just comment on one thing about Judy's comments? Because I agree with you, Judy, that the idea that, people are now talking about this idea of heart words, right? So you just look at the one part of the word that you can't understand. And the point that I really think is exciting is that when you start looking at morphology, like with says, there isn't a single part of that word that you can't understand, right? So if you take, instead of the whole word says, you deal with the base S-A-Y, and you do a little plus sign and an S, and that rewriter, you've probably seen word sums. My book is filled with word sums and matrices. You are able to help kids.
Page 17. Here.
That's great. You can help kids reconstruct that word, and so they really don't have anything. And so, and not every, this is something that I'm sharing in this book that I've learned from other people, that we all grew up with this idea that these words were irregular, that these words had to be taught as at least part of it having to be memorized. And what is exciting is being able to share the situations where that's not the case. And so, Faith, you were asking about what to do when a teacher is dealing with a scope and sequence. They're dealing with a phonics sequence, for example. How do they bring it in? I actually did a whole talk that was focused on this for the Northern California branch of the IDA. And I think it was called like Morphological Awareness, What Matters for Literacy, something. I can send you the links if you want to put it in like show notes and things. And basically there's a talk that's online, and I did like a write-up that goes with it that's just a free download. And it was about ideas sort of like I just shared with you, that you can just you could take a matrix. If you've got hat up on the wall and you put it in a little box and you put an S. Maybe hat's not a good example because it'd be nice if you could do an S and an ED. Maybe you do hug and you do hugs and you do, well, kisses would be ES, but I can never think of things on the spur of the moment. You know what I'm talking about. You take a base where the S is going to be pronounced and one where it's going to be pronounced Z. You add an ED. You again are not asking kids to learn how to do that spelling, especially if it's going to require the doubling. But you just say, let's notice how this pronunciation of these suffixes is changing, and we can feel that. We can, that whole phoneme awareness thing. Let's notice what the phonemes are. And realize that sometimes the phoneme T is actually spelled with a D, like in kissed, and we're not even pronouncing that E. And however you might want to say it, but it's a way to take what you are already doing that is essential and important, and you need to get through it, and bring just that frame in. And the reason I think this is important, Faith and Judy, is because I think we need to prepare kids to know this is where we're going. You have to start with the basics. But one of the basics is we build words by putting these units together, and they're spelled consistently, and sometimes they're pronounced differently. And I remember sitting across from a third grader who was trying to spell a word, and there was no way he could spell that word from its pronunciation. And I'm saying, look, there's a matrix here. You can use the base and use the suffix, and we've learned how to put it together. And he literally said to me, no, that's cheating. And he's trying to cover it up and trying to sound it out, which we couldn't do because of the way, we have so many words like that where we can't really know how they're spelled from just their pronunciation. So we want to prepare kids to say, this is going to be more and more important. This is going to help you spell more and more complex words. And when you have an older student, let's say, who really needs that basic information that they didn't get, it's a way to you can also make it much more helpful and meaningful to them, because you can work with more complex words that are more age appropriate, but they're still learning those phonics skills that they missed and need. So is that helpful, Faith?
Yes, it's very helpful. I mean, look, Sue, I've done this myself as a consultant, as a professional developer. I work with programs, and I bring in things that might not be part of the program. That's why Judy and I talk about how you can't be married to a program, because you need to be able to know way more than the program to be able to bring in what's important. So I do, I hear what you're saying. I think that our listeners, however, they have all these different terms thrown at them: phonology, orthography, morphology. It's overwhelming. And then they're given a program and they're left to have to figure it out. And for the most part, they're told they should be following the program. And
with what, Faith?
With fidelity, the F-bomb.
The original creators of that term on the Literacy View, and we now have the t-shirt to prove it.
That's right. So, they're told they have to follow a program, and then they don't know when to supplement, or if, they're allowed to. And, I think teachers really, their hands are tied in this. And, we had this conversation with Pete Bowers, and the way I think sometimes it's perceived, at least, that he doesn't really, value phonics very much. But from the conversation I got with him, from our conversation, was that he doesn't think there's something wrong with phonics. He thinks that morphology should be a part of the teaching from early on. Very much what you're saying. That's what I'm getting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you would let me just indulge me for a second. Okay. So I'll do a little demonstration. So if we are thinking that all kids need to know, first of all, I understand, Faith, what you're saying about teachers, and I'm totally understanding how challenging all of this can be. But I think this is why I feel lucky that I get to talk to teachers about how the system works and explain that to them. And they, bless their hearts, go back to their classrooms and figure out how to bring it in. And I can't tell you how many times I've given a talk and I've said, I'm not going to talk to you about what you can do on Monday, but teachers will come up afterwards and say, oh, I have this student and I know exactly what I'm going to do with them on Monday, because suddenly they know something about the system that they didn't know before. But if I asked you, you have great phonemic awareness. You both know the phoneme grapheme relationships inside and out. So if I asked you to spell a 4-phoneme word, band, B-A-N-D, can you spell that word accurately? How would you spell that word?
Band, B-A-N-D. But I know, but it sounds like band. Is that what you're trying to get at?
That's not even the issue. What if I wanted to write, we banned cell phones in the classroom this year?
Ah, okay. So yes, with the meaning of the past of to ban. Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, because
Wow, we have Sue. I don't want to interrupt you, but the crowd is going wild with your descriptions of words, and the chat is open, and we will be addressing this chat soon. And Zil Jager wrote band and band 2 different ways to.
I mean, once you start thinking about morphology, and I could give you a ton of examples. Days, is it D-A-Z-E or D-A-Y-S? Tease, is it I like lots of different teas or don't tease your sister, right? So one of the things that I want people to understand is that morphology, these are I have a whole list of single syllable words, 3 and 4 phonemes, where you have homophones, that one is complex, morphologically complex, made of 2 parts, one is morphologically simple. And so if we don't share that with kids from the very beginning, and maybe even give them a few examples and tell them how we are thinking about when we spell, we're not just looking at the pronunciation. That is obviously very important. But I mean, even if you take a word, one of the words would be a word like fax. Okay, fax. Am I spelling F-A-X? Am I pronouncing F-A-S, or am I pronouncing F-A-C-T-S? And in the word more than one fact, there's no T. Facts. So if kids have nothing other than pronunciation to anchor their spelling on, they will make mistakes. Now, here's the thing. I had no problem learning to spell. You two may have had no problem learning to spell. But if we have a really strong orthographic memory, we are good at that our brains do that orthographic mapping that is necessary really quickly and efficiently. We're going to think that we're hearing that in more than one fact because we know how to spell the word. So we want to share this with the kids, especially the kids who do not have that strong orthographic memory and need this kind of an anchor to help them learn how to spell these words. And so for teachers, it's about how do you get your kids thinking about these concepts along with all the other important things that you're doing.
What about cognitive overload? So for a young child just learning how to read, I understand you want to expose them to these things, but for some children, it might be just over the top, when they're trying to just wrap their heads around sounding out a word and feeling they accomplished something when they come out with the word, and then we're throwing a lot in. So look, I understand why all this is important. I think the issue, and that was one of our conversations, how early do you start and with how much of this do you present, and how do you know where's the cutoff? What What do you bring in? What do you hold back? And that's the conversation. And that's kind of what we're trying to get at with this science of reading. Is it opinion? Is there research to support any of this? As far as, when you start, we know that there's a lot of research on synthetic phonics that we have. But do we have research to say we should be starting all of this in kindergarten, or is that opinion? That's kind of what I think we want to dig into a little bit, that we all have our feelings and our, biases based on what we feel strongly about. But is there research saying this? From Danielle Colenbrander's research, it said that we should start early, right? With maybe oral language and presenting some of this in oral language. But as far as showing them the different spellings of T's and T's, T-E-A-S, and to tease someone, when do we start that? Hope I didn't overload you.
Faith, I just wanted to say one thing. Going back to Danielle, it's all coming back to me now too. I think going back to that episode, I remembered that she said there wasn't even scientific evidence to prove that all of this work is going to actually shift the needle as much as people anticipated, which is when I got a little emotional, because
with reading comprehension.
Right.
She said that with reading
comprehension.
But
right.
She did say for spelling, it did show a larger effect.
Right.
Effect for spelling, but not for overall.
Right. Which was really a big surprise for me. So there's a lot. So let's hear from Sue. And then we didn't forget you, chatters. We see a lot of people in the chat. We are going to get there very soon. We're a little excited. When Sue started to say all those different words, I can't believe how excited I got. It's amazing. Days or days, band or band. I mean, I got really excited. I felt like a kid in a candy shop when I heard all these words.
And the thing is, so then we can also say the same thing when we're dealing with words that aren't even, they're like bases. So if you say the word sight, are you saying S-I-T-E, C-I-T-E, or S-I-G-H-T, right? So the thing is, we have to teach kids how to spell those different base elements. And there is a reason for the spelling that we can, teachers can learn and understand. But what we don't want to do is give kids the false impression that all spelling is doing is representing the phonemes. Because that's not what the evidence is. I mean, I have a list of 5 or 6 examples of words that are bases spelled differently, homophones. And that's, I just got to the C's. I went to homophone.com. I'm like, let me pull a few, and I got to C, I had 5. So there are more. So if we think that the whole purpose of spelling is to represent pronunciation, and that's all it does, that's not true. Because what happens is if I say sight to you, you do not know what I mean. Do I mean vision? Do I mean I'm naming something in my citation, in my article, or I'm at a particular website, right? But if you look at the spelling, you instantly know what word it is. The spelling tells us which word we are looking at. That is incredibly important for reading comprehension. Louisa Moats has done examples of this in some of her work, where if you spelled words the same, you would have a harder time comprehending. So that is part of the function of the spelling system. It's an important function, is to identify a word as quickly as possible. And what we can do, and Faith, I appreciate your concern about cognitive overload. We do not want to cognitively overload kids. And that's why I trust teachers like you and researchers like others who can figure out what is the best way to bring this in and when. What I want people to know is this is how the system works. And I just don't see a whole lot of value in not telling kids how the system works when it comes up. When they get to a place where they're confused and you can say, hey, this is how it works. I will tell you that part of why I'm so passionate about this is I got into this whole field because I have a son who is dyslexic. And 20 years ago, we learned he's dyslexic. And he could not spell. He did learn to read. And Judy, he had wonderful teachers who were trained in reading recovery. And he did learn to read eventually. He had reading recovery teachers. Then he did a lot of phonics. He became a pretty good reader on the surface, but he didn't have phonemic awareness. He couldn't spell. And I remember trying to work with that kid on words like says and does, and he could not hold on to them. It was cognitive overload for him to try to remember this random spelling for in says. Today, he is a mechanical engineer. He understands structures. If I could have said to him back then, it was S-A-Y and S, we would have been done, because he would have understood the word. And so when you talk about the research and you talk about when to bring it in, all I'm saying is this is how it works. And let's tell kids how it works as soon as we possibly can. And teachers are wonderful at understanding how to scaffold things for their students, know what they need, know when to bring it in. But of course, they need to have that background knowledge so they can bring that in when it's appropriate.
So
we should open up the chat for a second after, otherwise it's going to get overwhelming too.
Okay. All right. We'll take a second to look through it. You want to read it, Judy? Go ahead. Read some questions or comments.
Okay. We had Zil say, but tell them the story of the great vowel shift. This is the why. Any comments on that one?
Tell them the story of the great vowel shift. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Anyway, we
Yes.
can get some more info on that. Then we had Lisa, Fundamental Learning by Lisa, say, yes, Sue, I love what you are saying. Building these early understandings are so key. Then we had Ronit. She got a little excited right when the episode started. She said, teacher knowledge is key. Then we had our fans, Emily Smith. Cheers to teacher knowledge. Yay, 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 yay. And then we had Ronit say, Sue's book should be required reading for all K-12 teachers. And I got lucky tonight. Sue's giving me a copy. Woo-hoo. Now we had Ronit say, and I didn't read this yet, so hopefully, let's see what this says. Sadly, I recently walked into a first grade classroom and the teacher had high frequency words written on hearts hanging from the ceiling. Oh. Faith, how are you feeling about that? You look a little emotional right now.
Well, you see a lot of these words that are put on boards, and that's not a way the kids are going to learn it. They're there.
Imagine they're hanging from a ceiling, though.
It doesn't matter if it's in front of them on a wall. That's not the way you teach those words. But, that it's, look, there are a lot of classrooms that have high frequency words, trick words that they just post. But I think what we're learning and what this episode is about, that spelling is really important, but not just spelling letter by letter, but bringing meaning in to this to help kids to remember, like say and says. And
teaching kids to look at those base words, those suffixes, like even in my own practice at my job, a lot of first graders, that oral reading fluency, it's not easy to get kids to read those passages. So we've been doing a lot of work where I tell my teachers, let's take out a pencil while they're reading and give them feedback. I quickly put a line under the base word so a kid sees a visual scaffold. A kid's forgetting suffixes. I put a scaffold where I put a circle around the S or a circle around the ED. Do I do that forever? No, I do it temporarily to help kids. We very often assume that kids make these connections automatically, but when kids see something in isolation and then they're seeing it in a book, we have to bridge that gap and show them that what you're learning in isolation is actually happening in books. How do we show that to kids? By showing them scaffolds, by not being afraid to take out a pencil, by not being afraid during your phonics block to say, what's the base word? What's the suffix? What's the whole word? And another thing that's working really well for me in the field is not calling one kid at a time. I was trained by Anita Archer in person, which I was very privileged to do. And Ask a lot of questions to everyone, choral response questions. Get all those brains working. Everybody, what sound does the vowel make? What is the suffix saying? So that's another great strategy that's working for me.
All right. So
Some
we
more
have
stuff.
from Mary Rose. How frequently would you slip in the morphology piece in a primary phonics lesson? It's tricky to add on to a scripted program when time is so constrained. We talked about that. So I think we addressed that one. As far as other comments, Emily asked, Sue, where can I find this list? I guess of like band and band, like all these pairs.
If you want to find examples of homophones, I went to it was a website, I think it's called homophone.com. And it's some person's kind of personal project where you can go and you can look at all these different homophones. Now, what's interesting is some of these are homophones where you would say, well, wait a minute, those two words aren't pronounced the same, because my way of pronouncing a word and your way of pronouncing a word might be a little different if you're British, if you're Australian. So that's one of the other things about our language that's so interesting, is that we often have different ways of pronouncing a word, but we always spell them the same, with a few exceptions, between the Brits and the Americans, if you will. And part of that, again, is because of the purpose of written language. We want to be able to understand the language, even if someone in Australia says these words in a slightly different way, we write them in the same way, because the written language has its own structure.
So, Sue, in your book in chapter 11, you said, what's that letter doing there? And so you give the example of answer, and answer has a W. And, people want to know why that W is there. And you mentioned the word swear. And so I think there are reasons that a lot of teachers don't know why certain letters are there. And they're just kind of taught to just remember all the letters. And that is heavy for a kid to have to just remember. And by pointing something like that out can help them. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'd love to talk about that, Faith. Thank you. So that is one of the other things that's going on in spelling that is really, really helpful for teachers to understand. And I wanted to say, because I'll forget, I'll get excited and start talking about examples and I'll forget to say this, but teachers who learn this sometimes say, oh my goodness, I don't know that. How am I supposed to teach that? How am I supposed to, I don't know. I've never been taught this. I would encourage teachers to find a couple of examples that they can use that make sense to them, that they can share with their students. And then when another word comes up and they're thinking, I'm not sure, a lot of teachers use what they call a wonder wall. I'm wondering why that word is spelled the way it is, and I'm not sure, but let's put that on the wonder wall. And then they may have colleagues they can go ask, they may email me, which teachers do, and then they can get some information to share with their students. And once you know the reason behind a particular word, you can share that with everyone. So with answer, the history of that word is that it came from Old English, I believe, and it was AN and then SWER. And it had to do with swearing, because when you answered, it's like if you two accused me of something and I responded, I answered that charge, I would have to swear to the truth of my statement. So that's where the history of the word answer. Now, we use it differently today, although you could still probably say, they answered the charge in court. But that would be less common. It's usually like, what's the answer to 2 + 2, right? So it's a different way of using it. That is those graphemes, like that W, are serving a function of kind of showing the history. And it's not like someone said, ooh, let's keep that in there, but it stayed in the word because of its history. Although there have been some words where people reinserted letters that had been taken out, like in debt, DEBT, that used to be it's related to debit, and it used.
Right, I was just thinking of that.
Yeah. And so somebody at some point said, let's put that B back in there to show that relationship. But if you don't know about the relationship, then it seems like this random letter, but it has nothing to do with the pronunciation. So another example is yolk, Y-O-L-K. That L comes from the history. That's also in the book. That comes from the history, and it's connected to the idea of yellow, because why is a yolk? A yolk came from the same word that means that led to the word yellow in English, because obviously a yolk is a yellow part of the egg. So once you know that, you have something to work with to help students get each and every letter right as they spell the word, and look at the word and go, oh yeah, that's that L, as they get comfortable with the word. But they have to orthographically map it, as we know, right? They need lots of exposure. And if they can spell the word right correctly, more than spell it wrong, they're going to have a quicker process of mapping that. So again, I get so excited. Did I answer your question, Faith?
No, I look, again, I'm pulling out things from your book that I think are relevant for viewers, our listeners, to be aware of, because there's so much that we have to teach. And yet, when you look at a program, it's either overloaded like a core program where there's so much in it, or sometimes a phonics program doesn't have enough. It's a slice just to kind of get kids started on, like, okay, whatever words we say, we can match and have sounds and letters matching, but we know it goes so much deeper, and that we have to get beneath the surface of words. The question is how and when. I think we all know it's important, but it's really getting into the nitty gritty of, what's the right time, how to do this. I love
and I think another thing that was mentioned in the beginning, do we follow a scope and sequence? I think there was one episode that I was very attached. I think it was the Peter Bowers episode that I just felt very connected to the concept of a scope and sequence, because back in my balanced literacy days, I didn't have a scope and sequence, right? So then when I finally, in my structured literacy life, was given a scope and sequence, I was so happy to receive that, because I knew that kids needed to know certain skills developmentally. It made sense. But at the same token, now that I've been immersed in this world for a while, in the structured literacy world, yes, I think the scope and sequence is critical, but I think that we also have opportunities that do come out naturally and organically, whether it be in your quote unquote knowledge building portion of the day, or whether you're writing something and it didn't exactly match, you're learning glued sounds, but a kid wrote something that wasn't connected to what you learned in phonics. You can take those organic and authentic moments and expose kids to things as well. Because I think the problem with being married to a program is very often, like, I'll give an example, and I don't know if this relates completely. A lot of my teachers are frustrated right now because oral reading fluency time is coming up in 2 months, especially with little kids. And kids haven't been exposed to a lot of things that, when we look at those passages, that kids should know. So the program that they're following has a scope and sequence. But even speaking to Wiley Blevins many times, he says that kids should actually know certain things by middle of first grade. So I think it's a balancing act for me, as somebody who's still in the field, of, following the scope and sequence, but also knowing what kids need to know in order to be successful. And I think a lot of my teachers are frustrated sometimes when we have meetings, because they've been thrown that F-bomb for so many years now. For like 2 or 3 years, it's been the F-bomb: fidelity, 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 fidelity.
Longer
now
than
that they have,
much longer than that.
right? But now that they have a firmer grasp on the science and all of that, I'm trying to move them towards integrity and knowing that they can make strategic moves. So are you married to a scope and sequence? I think from what I gathered when you first started talking, you're not married to one, like, in the most purest way. You do also agree that there could be those organic moments of discovery for kids, right? So
I'm saying that I think a scope and sequence is extremely helpful, and often it's necessary, and that's fine. that does not need to prevent you from doing this kind of thing. And the other thing, as you were talking, Judy, I was thinking of something else, and Faith, based on your question about teachers trying to fit this in with all the things that they're doing. The other place that teachers can look for opportunities to bring morphology in is in vocabulary, because even in the early grades, they will be reading and spelling very simple words, but there are vocabulary words that teachers are introducing. And they're not words that kids are expected to read and spell, right? And they might be much more sophisticated. So maybe if you look at, I've done this before with a first grade curriculum when I gave a talk, this is years ago, and I went and looked at the vocabulary that went along with it, and it was much more sophisticated. And I could see, oh, there's an ED in this word, there's an ED in this word, and it's just part of the vocabulary. So maybe you, instead of just talking about the word, you also have the spelling of the word, and you have a little word sum that shows plus ed. So the student is able to start seeing that as part of the system. And they're just getting primed that this is where they're heading, because it becomes more and more important as you get further along. And a first grade teacher cannot teach everything that a child needs to know about morphology, but they can teach the basic concept that we build words. They're like little Lego sets. You build this little component with your Legos, with 3 or 4 Legos, you build this one with 2, and then you put them together. And then that piece that has 2 parts might go in another word. It might go in this word. And this one that comes at the beginning of a word that's got 3 parts, that goes on lots of different words. Because when you start looking at morphology, the affixes, the prefixes and suffixes are much fewer than the base elements. So you can introduce the concept, and, we always start with inflectional suffixes and that kind of thing. And that works just great. That's what kids need to learn right away from the beginning. And so it becomes a process of, there is some organicness to it, but then also there could be some intentionality where a teacher can look ahead and say, in the next 3 weeks, we're going to use vocabulary words that include this particular prefix. I'm just going to point that out. It's just the concept is becoming part of the thinking of the children.
So Sue, let's get to the takeaways. All right. We were talking a little bit before the show. Give us your takeaways about spelling and morphology that you think, if there's just something that teachers really need to know, this is it. If there's something that administrators need to know, this is it. Parents, if there's something they really need to know about spelling and morphology, this is it. We want your takeaways based on your experience, that if you were going to kind of pare it down into what is really valuable for
and also a research nugget. We'll go step by step. Let's go easy on Sue. She's
we can provide the research. I'm not going to put her on the spot with that.
And then wait, the last one is also, how is all this going to affect student outcomes? Because that's what our show is really about. Why do we do what we do? It's really about the kids. It's really about making sure that what we're doing is making an impact.
Okay, so so I will give you 3 takeaways that I think are important for everyone to keep in mind about how the English spelling system works, because that is my area of focus. That is my work. It's about how English spelling works. So the first is that morphology is the framework and it's the foundation of the system. And when I say it's the framework, it's because of this little Lego bit where we put words together and we just build them. And the reason I say it's the foundation, I've started trying to explain this more because I worry that people think, oh, then we should just teach morphemes as whole units, and that's absolutely not the case. We need to teach the phoneme grapheme relationships, but it's the foundation because the spelling is much more stable than the pronunciation. So that ES in does is pronounced differently in does and in fishes, but it's spelled the same. So that's the first one. Morphology is the framework and foundation. The second one is the purpose of spelling is to allow us, when we are reading, to identify a word as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so part of that is giving signals of pronunciation, but that's not the whole purpose. We have these letters like the W in answer, like the L in yoke. We have an ed suffix that doesn't represent the pronunciation. I mean, that's spelled the same, even though the pronunciation is varying. So the purpose of spelling is to represent and help us to identify instantly a word when we are reading it. And the final one then is that even though we need to teach kids about oral language, right? And we want to build and leverage on kids' oral language. We want to keep building that. You can't just translate directly from spoken language to written language and expect that you're going to be able to spell or write cleanly and clearly or accurately. So to really understand written language, we want to start with, if we want to understand the spelling of a word, we want to start with its spelling and understand it and connect it back to its pronunciation, so that then we can help kids understand, the connection between the two. So that's the final then, is that spoken and written language have their own distinct systems. They're interconnected, as Mark Seidenberg says, they're interconnected, but they're not the same thing. And so we want to actually study written language to help kids understand how to work with it to read and spell.
So if I'm hearing you right, then the takeaway for a principal in all this would be that if they're going to evaluate a teacher and the teacher goes off the program to do some of this work, it should be valued.
I would think it should, but I also would encourage that principal to say, how do we create a community in the district or in the school so that teachers have the professional development they need to understand this, they feel supported, and they understand that this is an important part of what they need to do. So it's hard for a teacher to go off and do that on their own. Sometimes they do, but you're right. If the principal is going to come in and evaluate it and isn't clear about why it's important, then that's a problem for everybody. And so encouraging the kind of learning communities that may take place in schools where teachers can build their knowledge together and figure out how to bring this into the curriculum in a way that is age appropriate and that allows them to cover the material they need to cover. All of that makes sense to me. And I'm speaking not as an expert, but I'm just kind of giving you my opinion on that, or my perspective on that. I think that's a really good point. And I do think that building the learning community in the district is going to really help.
What about parents? What can they do? My thought is the oral language piece is the first thing that comes to my mind. What about you?
Definitely oral language. And, and I encourage parents to try to understand this. Parents aren't expected to teach their kids to read and spell. That's not their job. That's what the schools do. But they do want to support them with oral language and the right kind of, environment where the kids can be, come to school, ready to learn, all those kinds of things. And I'm sure you all have better ideas than I do about what parents can do on this kind of thing.
I mean, I'm thinking for parents that, when kids are, let's say, confused with inflectional endings, that if they can, they could just make sure they model it correctly, maybe repeat it or say the sentence with the correct, word with the inflectional ending for the kids, because we can't ignore that. Kids need to know, but you don't want to keep correcting a child. So maybe repeating the same thing and saying it the way it should be said. I mean, that's the first thing that comes to my mind, that, when parents ask what could they do, they could do a lot as far as having those conversations with kids and trying to, if they know themselves, obviously, if English is not their first language, then that would be very difficult for them.
Yes. And I do have to say, I remember talking to a number of parents who were native English speakers, who were, they were professionals, and they were kind of like, whoa, when they realized like that hugged ended in a d and kissed ended in a t, because we don't necessarily we're not conscious of that because we know the language, we speak it, we pronounce those inflectional endings naturally the way that makes sense given what comes before it, the phoneme that comes before it. And that just becomes part of our oral language. So parents can certainly do that, but a lot of this is unconscious. And so I do think parents have a role in developing oral language and helping kids learn, how words work, and they can play around with them with kids as well. And again, there are other guests you can have on who would have much better advice than I would on this. So I'm, kind of speaking out of turn, we're not talking about spelling now, so I'm out of my realm.
No, but really, we are priming that spelling piece, right? That is priming it with the oral language.
Oral language is really critical. We know that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Judy, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to add?
I think just reinforcing the concept of that kids need to make connections throughout their entire literacy block. Let's make sure that we capitalize on every moment of our day. I saw it here in my phonics block. I'm seeing it in my phonemic awareness block. I'm seeing it in my knowledge building or ELA piece, but I'm also seeing it and doing it in my writing block as well. I think it's much easier for kids to make those connections when it's organic and it happens throughout the literacy block. Teachers, please don't miss the opportunities to make those connections with kids. And I just have to say, Sue, you've been an absolute delight. I love everything about you. I love meeting you. You're definitely a no BS bestie. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I really do. We loved having you on tonight.
Well, thank you, Judy and Faith. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you both. And I appreciate the work you are both doing to try to get, the best information into the hands of teachers. It's really important work. And thank you for what you're doing.
And I just
want to give one more. Sorry.
I just want to mention one more time.
Oh, sorry.
About Sue's book. And I don't, as Judy knows, I don't just throw around
Yeah, let me say what happened. So the other night, I think it was yesterday, I found out, no, I didn't just find out we were recording, but Faith was like, Judy, I'm cleaning out my house. I don't need a million books in the house, but I want to make one recommendation, Judy. She said, this is one book you have to order, that it's practical, that it's easy to read, and that it will teach me a lot. So I cannot wait to get my hands on it. This is going to be part of my summer professional development. Yes, I see our viewers are agreeing. And I also want to give a major shout out to everybody that's been on this live with us and contributing in the chat. I see you, I hear you all. And the great thing is that we might just comment and write back to you today, tomorrow, during our commute to work. Thank you, everybody. We're changing lives one view at a time. Visit us on theliteracyview.com. Follow us, buy our merch, subscribe to our channel, and yes, sign up for our services. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night. We love you. And wait, Sue, congratulations. It's been a long time, but we didn't have to press the BS button even once.
Well, I consider that an hour well spent then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.